Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents A Hidden Wisdom, Medieval Contemplatives on Self-Knowledge, Reason, Love, Persons, and Immortality, by Christina van Dyke. Narrated by Christina van Dyke. For Bob Pasnaugh, my philosophical older brother, without whose prodding, surely you can write something about medieval mysticism, this book would never have begun. And for David, my favorite and only child, without whose prodding, seriously, Mom, how have you not sent that off yet? This book might never have been finished. Acknowledgements. This book has been a long time in the researching and writing, and I've worked up quite a debt of gratitude in the process. If I should have included you and have somehow forgotten, I'm terribly sorry. I encourage you to tell all your friends to read this book so that they can see what you are a part of. And I promise that I'll start my acknowledgements list earlier in the process of my next book. First credit goes, as promised, to the person who helped me come up with a title that evokes exactly what I was hoping for, while also providing the perfect hook for the grocery list of topics that make up the subtitle. Robin Dembroff, thank you. When the pandemic is over, and we're both in the same place at the same time again, dinner's on me. I also need to thank Bob Pasnaugh, not just for originally assigning me the chapter on mysticism in the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy, but for cheering me on ever since then as I've delved further and further into the medieval contemplative tradition, and especially for providing me with a full set of very helpful comments on the entire manuscript. Ursula Renz also played a crucial role in this book's history, although I'm sure she doesn't know it. I had already gone back to writing about Thomas Aquinas when she invited me to write a chapter on self-knowledge in medieval mystics for an Oxford Philosophical Concepts volume she was editing, and it was that essay that made me realize that I needed to keep going with the Contemplatives. I remain deeply grateful for that invitation and her encouragement of what I wrote. It is Christina Mercer, however, who can take direct credit for my actually writing this book. Not only did she tell me that I had a book in the making already in February 2016, but she then kept inviting me to give talks on relevant topics at workshops at her Center for New Narratives in the History of Philosophy at Columbia University. Those workshops introduced me to both people and ideas that have expanded and deepened my understanding of medieval mysticism and contemplativism in fantabulous ways. I'm sure I haven't done them full justice here, but special thanks in particular go to Katie Bugias, Holly Flora, and Lauren Mancia for being kick-ass theologians, art historians, and historians willing to hang out with this analytically trained philosopher. Speaking of people who have worked to create vibrant communities of scholars with cross-disciplinary interest, many thanks also to Mike Ray and the crew of his Logos conferences. The Logos conferences may be a thing of the past, but their impact remains, and I appreciate being made to feel part of a group, namely philosophers of religion and analytic theologians, I'd long felt on the outside of. Thanks also to Scott MacDonald for continuing to hold the Cornell Medieval Colloquia each year, even now that they're actually happening in Brooklyn and, in 2020 to 2022, online. The chance to connect and reconnect there with stellar scholars and friends like Susan Brower Toland, Peter King, Scott Williams, and Thomas Williams has made both my work and my life better in myriad ways I find it hard to quantify. I am also endlessly grateful to Thomas Williams for reading this entire manuscript and providing me with not only a host of useful comments, but several much-needed laughs. These people need to be beaten with the Jesus stick. And any number of pep talks. I look forward to finding out with you exactly what level of snark is allowed in heaven. General thanks go to Elizabeth Barnes and Ross Cameron for their relentless support and encouragement. To Sarah Bernstein for such good advice about so many things and always having my back. To Molly Brown, star to my Barb and mother of my god puppy Elodie, whose adorableness kept me going during the darkest part of the pandemic. To Amber Graffune and Lacey Hudspeth for encouragement, support, and a place to vent about the mysticism haters. to Amy Seymour, Julia Staffel, and Natalie Hart for being my writing partners at coffee shops in New York City, Boulder, and Grand Rapids. And to Lori Paul for making me feel like it was obvious that I was going to write an amazing book and that the only real question was how to make sure the right people read it. A most particular thank you to Keshav Singh for making me the coochie catcher that decided which version of the names of medieval figures I was going to use in this book when I was going bananas trying to decide between things like Johannes and Jan, of oint or doint. The result may be a bit idiosyncratic, but it is at least consistent throughout. Many thanks as well to Peter Momchilov, who has been wonderfully encouraging of this project and who sent me a few crucial email nudges at just the right moment in the fall of 2021. It's hard to know exactly what sort of gratitude I owe to Calvin College, now university. On the one hand, both the college and my department provided me with deeply appreciated support and encouragement when I was a full-time single parent and an assistant, and then tenured, and then full, professor. On the other hand, after several truly stressful years, in 2020, continued budgetary shortfalls led the university to cut a number of tenured positions, including mine, and I'd be lying if I said that I missed being there. I do miss what Calvin used to be, however, and I have a deep appreciation not only for the mission it now seems to have lost, but for the people I've been fortunate enough to have shared a department with there, particularly Lindsay Brainerd, Terence Cuneo, Rebecca Conondike DeYoung, Ruth Grunhout, the next-door office mate than which none greater could be conceived, Matt Hulteman, with only one N, Lee Hardy, Al Planninga, who spent several victory laps there after retiring from Notre Dame, Del Ratch, and Kevin Tempe. The tireless work of first Donna Kreithoff and then Laura McMullen and Corey Baker kept me relatively organized and mostly in the right places at the right times, and I can't thank them enough for that. I am also deeply grateful to the students who have passed through my life over the 20 years I spent as a faculty member at Calvin, many of whom I now count as friends. You taught me that the most effective way to communicate the importance and value of philosophy is to live what you say you believe, and I am the better for it. The next two paragraphs are lists of places that supported my research financially and/or invited me to speak to them about aspects of this project. And I'm very self-conscious about the fact that they might read like me bragging about what I've been privileged to receive. But I am both obligated to list them and quite grateful for the opportunities they all represent. That said, feel free to skip ahead to the part where I start talking about my family. In chronological order from when I began seriously to work on mystical experiences in Immortality in 2014 to the present, I owe thanks to John Hawthorne's New Insights and Directions for Religious Epistemology project for funding a Hillary Term Fellowship at Oxford University, and to John Martin Fisher's Immortality project for a year-long grant to support my project, Everlasting Happiness, Immortality and the Afterlife, which I amazingly got to combine with a year-long fellowship at Notre Dame's Center for the Philosophy of Religion. Both projects thought they were funding me to write a book on Aquinas on the afterlife, but instead they actually supported much of the initial research for this book, and I'm extremely grateful. Thanks also to the University of Colorado at Boulder for inviting me to be their inaugural distinguished visitor, to the Aspects of Religious Experience grant that Lori Paul and Mike Ray administered for their generous support of Robin Dembroff's and my Embodied Religion, Social Structures and Religious Experience, to the Calvin Alumni Research Grant for travel funding in 2017, which is when I took a number of the photographs that appear in this book, to Dean Zimmerman and the Rutgers Center for the Philosophy of Religion for a year-long fellowship there, and finally, to Sidney Sussex College at the University of Cambridge for granting me the visiting fellowship I was only 5 weeks away from when the pandemic shut everything down in March 2020. Here is a compressed list of places at which I've given talks related to the content of this book, and a far too truncated list of the wonderful people who have spent time talking to me about it there. I am deeply grateful to all these places and all the people who have worked to get me there, with special thanks to the administrative staff at various institutions who made my presence possible. Thanks to audiences at all 3 regional APAs for their feedback on various talks. The Epistemology Brown Bag Series at Northwestern University, the Cornell Colloquium in Medieval Philosophy, L'Abri Fellowship International, the University of Konstanz, the University of Leeds Center for Philosophy of Religion, as well as the Leeds School of Philosophy, Religion, and History of Science Mangoluzzi Lecture Series in 2019, with a special shout-out to Mark Wynn and Robbie Williams for hosting me so wonderfully. Lingnan University and the University of Hong Kong, Bogachi University in Istanbul, the University of St. Thomas and St. Paul, the Society for Medieval Logic and Metaphysics, the Brooklyn College Minorities and Philosophy Chapter, the Sheffield Religious Experience Workshop, the Center for New Narratives in the History of Philosophy at Columbia University, the University of North Carolina at Asheville, St. Mary's Philosophy Department Retreat in South Bend, Creighton University, the 40th Anniversary Conference of the Society of Christian Philosophers, Shiva Kleinschmidt's California Conference in Metaphysics, the Society of Medieval and Renaissance Philosophy, Georgetown University, St. Andrews University, the Practical Philosophy Workshop and Women in Philosophy Series at the University of Chicago, the Ayers Lecture in Philosophy and Theology at Furman University, the Axon Johnson Foundation Seminar for the Concept of Self-Knowledge in Ancient and Modern Times, the University of Indiana at Bloomington, the Free University at Amsterdam, the American Academy of Religion, the Goliardic Society at Western Michigan University, the Medieval Philosophy Colloquium at the University of Toronto, the Rutgers Center for Philosophy of Religion, the Princeton Project in the Philosophy of Religion, the University of Trier, and Leiden University. Okay, and now to my family. Tolstoy famously begins Anna Karenina with the claim that happy families are all alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I know that he's supposed to have meant that there is a list of common attributes that all families need in order to be happy. But if you've ever met my family, you will understand why that sentence has always made me laugh. We are, in general, very happy, and yet I can't imagine our hilarious, bizarre family being like any other family in the world. Mom and Dad, I'm more glad than I can put into words that you're still here to see this book come out. Health scares of 2021 notwithstanding. I promise to write any number of other books if you promise to stick around to bug me about whether I finish them yet. To my siblings, Jamie, John, and Carla Joy, I love you excessively. Our weekly Zoom family chats during the pandemic have made me feel closer to you than ever, despite the physical distances between us, and have often left my stomach hurting from laughing so hard. Thank you also to Jamie and Robin, and Carla Joy and Steve for producing such excellent nibblings. John and Aki, Max and Pepper have also been quite excellent catlings. I've already dedicated this book to David, but I want to make sure everyone knows that David's amazingness goes far beyond skeptical side-eye and effective prodding to finish book manuscripts. My child, your presence in my life has made me happier than I could ever have expected or even desired. It may not have been easy to share a one-bedroom apartment with you during strict lockdown in 2020, but there's no one else I would rather have gotten irritated with under those circumstances. No one, that is, except perhaps my beloved, Andrew Arlig. Which is good, because I got to share all the lockdowns with you. Andy, I have been working on this book the entire time that we have been together, and you have never been anything but supportive and encouraging about it. It's been a challenge in any number of ways combining our lives over the past 5.5 years, but a challenge that is more than worth the effort. Our love is not a unicorn, magical and illusory. It is a narwhal, rare, weird, and extremely real. Here's to years and years of swimming together in the same direction. Preface. In college and graduate school, I was taught that women didn't do philosophy in the Middle Ages. My teachers were clear that this was a shame, but they were also clear that their job was to teach me facts. And the facts were that 1, medieval philosophy happened primarily in the cathedral schools and universities of something called the Latin Christian West during the 11th to 15th centuries, and 2, women weren't allowed to participate in those discussions. This first fact has been completely overturned in the past 20 years. It would be difficult to find a well-respected book about medieval philosophy published today that didn't acknowledge the importance of Greek, Islamic, and Jewish thought from the 6th century on, and new editions of old textbooks generally take pains to include a variety of these sources, alongside the requisite Anselm, Abelard, Aquinas, Scotus, and Occam. The truth of the second fact, however, remains largely accepted, for women were generally no more welcome in medieval Greek, Islamic, or Jewish schools than they were in their Latin counterparts. On this view of the history of philosophy, women were essentially barred from contributing to philosophy between Hypatia's death in Alexandria in the 5th century and Descartes' correspondence with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in the 17th century. I don't think what I was taught reflects badly on my teachers. At the time, I started college in 1990 and finished my PhD in 1999, this was not just the dominant narrative about women in medieval philosophy, it was the only narrative. It didn't even bother me particularly. I wrote my dissertation on Thomas Aquinas' theory of individuation and identity for human beings, and I was tenured for my work on Aquinas' metaphysics and Robert Grosseteste's theory of illumination. I found this work both challenging and rewarding. I channeled my interests in gender and sexuality into side projects in the philosophy of gender, particularly projects that explored the relation between gendered eating and religion. Mentally, I compartmentalized my research as addressing either medieval philosophy, as characterized by Fact 1, or the philosophy of gender. I hadn't realized yet that the or could be inclusive. I originally read Carolyn Walker Bynum's monumental Holy Feast and Holy Fast, for instance, not because it was about the Middle Ages, but because it was about women and the religious significance of food. The bookshelves in my office were packed with Latin texts and secondary literature on Augustine, Boethius, Anselm, Aquinas, Scotus, and Occam. My bookshelves at home started to fill up with titles like Holy Anorexia and God and the Goddesses, Vision, Poetry, and Belief in the Middle Ages. And then, in the academic year 2007 to 8, I spent my first sabbatical working with Bob Pasnaugh on the Cambridge history of medieval philosophy. At some point, we had received all 55 commissioned chapters, over 1,000 pages of state-of-the-art scholarship on medieval philosophy in the Greek and Latin Christian, Islamic, and Jewish traditions. And we realized that not a single chapter discussed texts authored by medieval women. You could read the entire manuscript and fairly form the impression that women had taken a collective pass on thinking in the Middle Ages. This was an unacceptable state of affairs, but how to address it? Adding a chapter called something like Women and Medieval Philosophy struck us both as the worst sort of ad hoc maneuver. Adding more mentions of women in the chapters on, say, poverty or religious orders or war didn't address this central issue, which was that it seemed highly implausible that women had really not contributed anything of value to the ongoing practice of philosophy in the millennium we were covering in the volume. The question Bob and I ended up asking each other was, where were women writing in the Middle Ages, and what were they writing about? As soon as we phrased the question that way, I realized I already knew the answer. I just hadn't connected the dots. My teachers had been right that women didn't participate in philosophy as it was practiced in scholastic contexts, that is, in the cathedral schools and universities, but women did author a vast number of mystical and contemplative texts in the later Middle Ages, and these women were hardly writing in a philosophical or theological vacuum. They were integral parts of the intellectual, theological, and cultural movements of their day. My joint expertise in 13th century philosophy and gender studies meant that it fell to me to explore the medieval contemplative tradition for its philosophical insights. As I rolled up my sleeves and went to work on what became the chapter in the Cambridge history titled Mysticism, I discovered that although mystics and contemplatives in the Middle Ages might not have thought of themselves as engaging in philosophy per se, and although what they wrote often tends not to fit neatly into our contemporary conceptions of philosophy, they have a wealth of insightful things to say about philosophical topics of perennial interest, such as self-knowledge, reason and its limits, will and love, persons, and immortality in the afterlife. Furthermore, the fact that women writing in these traditions didn't think of themselves as engaging in philosophy per se shouldn't prevent us from considering their works as philosophical. For in this respect, they resemble most of the other figures we today study under the descriptor medieval philosopher. Augustine's Confessions were written as a spiritual memoir, for instance, and Anselm's ontological argument is presented as part of a prayer for understanding. Even the paradigms of scholastic philosophy, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William Ockham, were masters of theology rather than philosophy at their respective institutions. If we shift our conception of medieval philosophy to include contemplative texts, as I argue we should do in Chapter 1, we find a host of women doing philosophy in the Middle Ages, including any number of women not addressed in this book, which focuses on the Latin Christian tradition from the 13th to 15th centuries. When my initial attempt to demonstrate the relevance of the contemplative tradition to the study of medieval philosophy appeared in the first edition of the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy in 2010, however, my colleagues in the field didn't seem particularly interested. As I continued to argue for its importance and to discuss the contributions of women to this tradition, I started to wonder if I was trying to make the medieval philosophical version of fetch happen. Then, just as I was giving up hope, there came a surge of interest in the topic. A surge due, in large part, no doubt, to the successful efforts of scholars like Andrew Janiak, Marcy Lascano, Christia Mercer, Eileen O'Neill, and Lisa Shapiro to demonstrate the philosophical significance of women from the early modern period, whose work had previously been downplayed or ignored. I started being asked to give talks on the medieval contemplative tradition and the women writing within it, and to contribute papers on the contemplative tradition to special journal issues and edited volumes. My fellow historians of medieval philosophy started to ask me which women-authored texts they should include on their syllabi, and on what topics. And then, in February 2016, Christia Mercer told me almost offhandedly over breakfast at the Nassau Inn in Princeton that the work I'd already done on this topic basically amounted to a book, and that I should just sit down and write it. And so, over the course of 6 very long and full years, I did. Writing this book has been both challenging and exciting. It's difficult to highlight the philosophical insights of women-authored texts without coming across as essentializing their status of women, for instance, but I've done my best. In each chapter, I discuss the range of contemplative views on a given topic in works by both men and women from the Rome-based Christian tradition of the 13th to 15th centuries. Focusing only on women's contributions would produce as skewed a picture of the intellectual landscape as the traditional focus on scholastics has already produced. At the same time, I center the contributions of medieval women throughout this book, for even within the contemplative tradition, the philosophical and theological insights of medieval male figures consistently receive more attention than their female counterparts. Take, for instance, the introduction to Pseudo-Dionysius, the Complete Works, in which Jean Leclerc traces Pseudo-Dionysius's influence in Western Europe through the 14th and 15th centuries as follows. The works of Dionysius provided a powerful contribution in the 14th and 15th centuries to the spirituality that flowered in the Rhine Valley and elsewhere among theologians of the abstract school, as historians have termed it. Meister Eckhart, died 1327, proved capable of adopting fundamentally Dionysian themes while changing the meaning substantially. Several other writers did more or less the same, each in his own way. Tauler, died 1361, Ruysbroeck, died 1381, Gerson, died 1429, Nicholas of Cusa, died 1464, Denis the Carthusian, died 1471, Harphius, died 1477, and Marsilio Ficino, died 1499. Although this list includes several figures who are hardly household names, it excludes every single woman writing in the same tradition in this period, even those such as Marguerite Porete and Hadovich, who had an identifiable influence on Eckhart and Ruysbroeck. This list also overlooks the centrality of Dionysian themes of unknowing, apathetic silence, and divine darkness in works by any other number of women mystics at this time, such as Angela of Foligno. Two more recent examples demonstrate the continued neglect of women in discussions of medieval philosophy and theology, and they represent merely the tip of the iceberg of scholarship that fits this bill. First, Stephen Bolter's 2019 Why Medieval Philosophy Matters includes as good examples of important medieval figures who were not scholastics the following list: John Scotus Erugena, the Cathari and Albigensians, Bernard of Tours, Amalric of Ben, Joachim de Flores, Vidalo, Theodoric of Freiburg, Raymond Lilly, Roger Marston, Meister Eckhart, Raymond of Sebund, and Nicholas of Cusa. Again, not a single woman makes the cut. Second, the 2020 Oxford Handbook of Mystical Theology devotes a great deal of attention to the Western Christian medieval tradition, and yet an entire chapter on Trinitarian indwelling fails to even mention Julian of Norwich, while the chapter on depth, ground, and abyss discusses Eckhart, Tauler, and others, again without so much as paying lip service to Hadovich's and Marguerite Porette's influence on those authors, much less their own original contributions. Another chapter discusses theological epistemology and apophasis in both the intellectualist and the affective Christian mystical traditions without naming a single woman, despite the overwhelming number of medieval women who write about these topics. If I have leaned too far in this book towards prioritizing women's voices over those of their male contemporaries, it is in the spirit of Aristotle's advice in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 7, to steer towards the opposite extreme in attempting to reach the mean, in this case, the mean of justice. Mysticism and contemplativism have traditionally been some of the very few contexts in which people otherwise denied a voice by Christian institutions can speak truth to power and be heard. Their focus is not on intensive study of hierarchical systems of knowledge and texts available primarily to the elite, but on accessible practices such as meditation and contemplative prayer, and on personal experience of God, which is available to anyone. Because the Christian tradition acknowledges mystical experiences and knowledge of God's hidden truths as granted by God via an act of grace, the philosophy and theology of mysticism and contemplativism can never be simply the purview of the powerful. They are available to anyone and everyone God chooses. And, as Scripture teaches us, God consistently chooses the disenfranchised and overlooked. One of the most important legacies of the medieval contemplative tradition is the way in which it creates space for people to connect directly with God and to claim to God's own authority and their love-filled striving to unsettle the unjust status quos of this world. Consider Catherine of Siena, for instance. the 24th child of a Sienese cloth dyer who becomes an influential political
Sample complete. Ready to continue?